In early February 1970, the world reeled under screaming headlines. Germany's bold declaration to resume unrestricted submarine warfare pushed its fragile ties with America to the breaking point. The raging waves of the Atlantic stole the spotlight, but thousands of miles away, in the icy forests stretching across what is now Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, the war at sea was nothing compared to the bone-cutting Guild and the shadows lurking in the night. The eastern front of World War I, a battle line stretching over 1,000 miles from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was where German and Russian forces clashed in brutal conditions, fighting not only each other, but a merciless nature. Jake Miller, a young American from New York who joined the German army with heroic dreams, huddled in a shallow trench, his frozen hands clutching a Mauser M98. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from a cold so piercing it felt like being locked in a giant freezer back home. A few hundred meters away, through a thick and relentless blizzard, Mike Petrov, a steadfast Russian soldier, stood watch in the dark. His eyes scanned the forest, but swirling snowflakes limited his vision, devouring everything in their dance. Both Jake and Mike knew war wasn't their only enemy. The temperature had plunged below -20 degrees, cold enough to turn breath into instant frost, and compasses spun wildly, as if playing a cruel prank like find your way back to Fort Bragg without GPS. Machine guns, once the pride of both sides, were now useless scrap, their coolant frozen in the barrels. Food, the meager rations left, was hard as stone, inedible unless thawed over a fire. If MREs existed back then, Jake would have quipped they were worse than a 99-cent burger from a roadside dive, and at least the burger had some flavor. But in this deadly cold, even jokes were a luxury. Soldiers on both sides curled up, praying to survive the night, while the blizzard howled like the soundtrack to a Hollywood horror flick. The Eastern Front wasn't like the grand trench battles of the West, where British and French forces shaped the war's fate with fortified lines and calculated strategies. Here, the battlefield was an endless wilderness, dominated by snow-laden forests and icy hills. Trenches, if they could be called that, were shallow pits, offering little protection from artillery or snipers. Jake had heard of the epic clashes at Verdun and the Somme, where soldiers fought like actors in a historical drama. But here, he felt like a trapped hunter in a forest, unsure whether the enemy or nature would strike first. Each night, as darkness swallowed the land, Jake tried to keep spirits high with jokes among his comrades. He'd say they were camping at the Hilton, just forgot the heater and a Wendy's order. The soldiers around him chuckled, but the laughter didn't last. As the sun set, the cold sank into their bones, and strange sounds began to rise from the deep forest. At first, Jake thought it was just the wind, or maybe branches snapping under the weight of snow. But then a chilling howl sliced through the night, long and eerie, as if echoing from the depths of hell. He glanced at Tom Hayes, his close friend from Pennsylvania, who'd hunted deer since childhood. Tom wasn't smiling. His eyes were fixed on the darkness, his hand gripping his rifle. "That's not the wind, Jake," he whispered, his voice low like a ghost story told by a campfire. "Those are wolves, and they're getting closer." Jake tried to brush off the fear with a quip. "Guess they just want to watch the Super Bowl with us." But deep down, a bad feeling began to creep in. Across the lines, Mike Petrov felt the same dread. A Russian soldier accustomed to harsh winters, he was no stranger to cold. But these howls were different. They weren't the calls of the wolves he'd known as a boy in his village. These carried a hunger, a desperation, as if the wolves bore a curse. Mike clutched his Mosin Nagant, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. Jake and Mike, unaware of each other's existence, were trapped in the same nightmare. War had turned this forest into a deadly arena where humans weren't the only predators. The wolves, driven to the edge by hunger and the devastation of war, were changing. They no longer feared humans. They no longer feared guns. And in the darkness, their red eyes began to glint like ghostly lanterns, waiting for the moment to strike. Each night, the howls grew closer, fiercer, like a warning that the war between men was just the prelude. Jake, with the curiosity of an American boy raised on Bigfoot tales and Area 51 conspiracies, began to wonder if these wolves were truly just animals, or something far more sinister, awakened by the blood and smoke of war. Mike, steeped in Russian folklore of forest spirits, harbored similar doubts. As the blizzard roared through the trees, both soldiers felt a chilling truth. The Eastern Front wasn't just a place where men fought each other. It was a battlefield where nature itself had declared war, and the true predators were stalking in the dark, ready to turn soldiers into prey. The winter of 1917 was a relentless nightmare. The biting cold, sharp as a blade against the skin, turned every moment on the Eastern Front into a test of survival. Jake Miller and his platoon, stationed in a dense, snow-laden forest near what is now the border of Poland and Lithuania, clung to life by kindling feeble fires. The flames crackled just enough to thaw the ice caked on their Mauser M98 barrels, but they couldn't drive out the cold that seeped into their bones. The soldiers, huddled in tattered coats, looked like ghosts in the thick fog, grasping for fleeting warmth amid a howling blizzard. Not far away, across a desolate expanse of snow and scattered bodies, Mike Petrov and his Russian comrades faced an even harsher fate. Crippled by food shortages, they survived on crumbs of rock-hard bread and watery soup that froze solid. In the rear, Russia was unraveling. Civil unrest simmering, the Bolshevik Revolution looming on the horizon. The Russian army's will to fight crumbled like thin ice under rare sunlight. Both Jake and Mike, though on opposing sides, were trapped in so-called trenches, little more than shallow pits scratched into the frozen ground, offering scant protection from roaring artillery or the cold precision of snipers' bullets. As night fell, darkness swallowed the forest, bringing an indescribable unease. Jake, with the upbeat spirit of a New York kid, tried to lift his comrades' morale with jokes. He'd reminisce about home, where he and friends gathered to watch football and devour greasy burgers from food trucks. If we had MREs back then, he'd say, they'd probably be worse than a cheap street sandwich, but at least you'd get some sauce. But in the long, frigid nights when the wind wailed through bare trees, his laughter faded. Another sound began to creep into his mind. Not the boom of cannons, not the crunch of boots, but low, guttural growls, as if rising from some otherworldly realm. One night, as a faint moon pierced the fog, Jake heard it clearer than ever. It wasn't the wind or snapping branches. It was alive, menacing, like the whisper of a predator stalking its prey. He turned to Tom Hayes, his best friend from Pennsylvania, a lifelong deer hunter with a woodsman's instincts. "Hear that, Tom?" Jake asked, forcing a playful tone. "Think Bigfoot's out there looking for a big screen to watch the Super Bowl?" But Tom didn't smile. His eyes were locked on the darkness, his hand gripping his rifle. "That's not Bigfoot, Jake," he said, his voice low like a ghost story by a campfire. "Those are wolves, and they're hungry." Tom wasn't exaggerating. The war had ravaged the forest's ecosystem. Deer, elk, rabbits, the wolves' natural prey, had been wiped out by bombs, hunting, and famine. Soldiers' corpses strewn across the battlefield became easy meals for the packs. At first, the wolves were stealthy, dragging frozen bodies into the shadows. But as winter dragged on, when the dead were no longer enough to sate their hunger, the wolves began to change. They grew bold, they lost their fear, and their eyes, glowing like headlights in night vision scopes, began to fix on the living. Jake had heard wolf stories back home, but those were timid creatures, easily scared off by a gunshot or firelight. These wolves were different. They were true monsters, standing up to 5 feet tall, their silver-gray fur glinting under the moon, their red eyes blazing like hellfire. Once, while on watch, Jake caught a glimpse of a massive shape darting past the forest's edge. It moved so fast he thought he'd imagined it, but the stench, a mix of dried blood and damp earth, lingered, sending a shiver down his spine. On the Russian side, Mike Petrov felt the same threat. Raised in rural Russia, he was no stranger to wolves, but these creatures were unnatural. One night, while checking the barbed wire around his post, a piercing howl rang out, so close it felt like it came from right behind him. He spun around, seeing only darkness and swirling snow. But for a fleeting moment, he swore he saw glowing eyes staring from the brush. They weren't the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of a predator sizing up its prey. Jake and Mike, divided by battle lines and language, were beginning to grasp a terrifying truth. This war wasn't just between humans. This forest, with its deadly cold and endless dark, was breeding something far worse. The wolves weren't just hungry. They were growing reckless, ferocious, as if driven by a force beyond nature. Jake, with the curiosity of an American raised on tales of forest monsters, began to wonder if these were mere wolves or something darker, awakened by the blood and smoke of war. Mike, steeped in Russian folklore of woodland spirits, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted by something not of this world. Each night, the wolves' howls drew closer, fiercer, like a warning that their time was running out. In the darkness, amid cold and hunger, Jake and Mike both sensed a chilling reality. They weren't the only predators in this forest, and the true hunters, with razor-sharp teeth and glowing red eyes, were preparing for an attack no one could predict. On an early February morning in 1917, as a feeble dawn struggled to pierce the thick fog blanketing the forest, the Eastern Front erupted into chaos. Heavy snow fell, obscuring everything, turning the woods near the Polish-Lithuanian border into a dreamlike realm where the line between life and death grew razor-thin. Jake Miller, huddled in a shallow trench, gripped his Mauser M98, his heart pounding as Russian artillery roared. His exhausted, starving platoon braced to return fire. But no one, not even the most seasoned soldiers, could have anticipated the horrifying threat about to descend. A threat that bore no trace of human warfare. As the battle flared, with rifle rounds tearing through the air and grenades exploding, shaking the frozen ground, a new sound rose, cutting through the din of war. It wasn't artillery or soldiers' cries. It was a low, menacing growl, as if the forest itself had come alive. From the shadowed, snow-laden trees, a massive pack of wolves surged forward. These were no ordinary beasts. Over 6 feet long, their silver-gray fur gleamed like steel in the dim light. their razor-sharp teeth glinting with lethal intent. Their eyes, red as glowing embers, swept the battlefield, fearless amid gunfire and the flickering flames of explosions. Jake, scrambling behind a fallen tree, felt his blood freeze as he witnessed the horror. A wolf as large as a small bear clamped its jaws around the leg of a wounded German soldier, dragging him into the darkness. The man's scream, raw with pain and despair, echoed before abruptly silencing, as if swallowed by the night. The stench of blood mingled with damp earth and gunpowder, creating a deathly aroma that made Jake shudder. He'd heard war stories, imagined himself a hero in a Hollywood epic. But this was no Saving Private Ryan. This was reality, more terrifying than any film he'd seen on a New York screen. Across the lines, Mike Petrov, crouched behind a frozen mound, faced the same nightmare. A wounded Russian comrade lay moaning in the snow. Before Mike could react, 3 wolves descended like specters, tearing the man apart. The sickening crunch of bones mixed with the wolves' growls paralyzing Mike. He'd faced snipers, survived barrages, but never felt so powerless. These wolves didn't act like starving animals. They moved with eerie coordination, like a trained unit, targeting the weakest on the field. In a rare moment, the gunfire from both sides fell silent. Without orders, Germans and Russians alike realized the true enemy wasn't human. Jake heard Captain Hans Weber, the German commander, shout through the blizzard, "Aim at the wolves!" His voice was firm but betrayed panic. On the Russian side, Mike saw Captain Ivan Volkov, pale-faced, issue the same command. Soldiers, sworn enemies moments ago, turned their rifles on the wolves. Rifles roared, grenades detonated, ripping through the air. Wolf blood, dark crimson, stained the white snow, mingling with the blood of fallen soldiers. The battle unfolded like an endless nightmare. Jake, hands trembling from cold and adrenaline, fired shot after shot, each bullet a prayer for survival. He saw one wolf fall, only for another to charge, its teeth flashing in the light of an explosion. Across the field, Mike, his Mosin Nagant burning hot, shot a wolf lunging at a comrade. Each round was a desperate bid to wrest control from nature's brutal grip. After a bloody clash, about 50 wolves lay motionless in the snow, their massive bodies twitching one last time before stilling. The survivors, with furious howls, retreated into the forest's depths. As the final shots faded, an eerie silence blanketed the battlefield. Jake and Mike, strangers to each other, both sensed the strangeness of the moment. Just minutes ago, they, enemies vowed to destroy one another, had fought side by side against a shared foe, not human, but nature in the form of monstrous beasts. Jake, with the spirit of an American raised on tales of courage, felt a strange pride, as if he'd played in a historic football game where rival teams united against a storm. Mike, steeped in Russian folklore, wondered if these wolves were the embodiment of an ancient curse, roused by the blood and smoke of war. But war allowed no time for reflection. As the wolves retreated, both sides quietly resumed their duties. Jake and his German comrades dragged the wounded back to the trenches, bandaging bleeding injuries in the searing cold. Mike, on the Russian side, helped bury those who'd never return. Both knew the unity they'd just shared was a fleeting spark in the darkness of war. The wolves may have retreated, but the real conflict between man, and perhaps man and nature, was far from over. In the hearts of Jake and Mike, a question lingered, unanswered. Were those wolves truly just animals, or something more terrifying, summoned from the forest's depths? As they returned to their trenches, the cold and darkness closed in, whispering that this nightmare was only beginning. After the wolves' bloody assault, the forest on the eastern front sank into a terrifying silence. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the bloodstains and corpses, as if nature sought to erase the nightmare's traces. But the wolves didn't relent. A few nights later, they returned, fiercer and bolder than ever. Their howls, sharp and menacing, echoed through the bare trees, so close that Jake Miller felt they were stalking just behind him. In the darkness of his shallow trench, he gripped his Mauser M98, his heart pounding, not from the 20 cold, but from a premonition that death was closing in, not in the form of Russian enemies, but as gray-furred phantoms with blazing red eyes. Jake wasn't alone in sensing the danger. Tom Hayes, his Pennsylvania friend who'd hunted deer since childhood, now wore a rare look of panic. In a fleeting moment between guard shifts, Tom met Jake's gaze, as if wanting to say something profound, but only whispered, his voice trembling. "They're not afraid of us anymore, Jake. They think we're dinner." The words, though soft, hit like a bullet, lodging deep in Jake's mind. He forced a weak smile, picturing New York strays scattering at the sight of headlights. But here, in this frozen forest, the wolves didn't flee. They hunted. Across the lines, Mike Petrov, the steadfast Russian soldier, faced the same terror. One night, as he stood watch by a feeble fire, a massive shape emerged through the fog. A lone wolf, as large as a small bear, its silver-gray fur glinting under the faint moon. Its eyes glowed like headlights in a night vision scope, staring at Mike with an eerie calm, as if weighing whether he was worth attacking. Mike, guided by a soldier's instinct, raised his Mosin Nagant and fired. The shot tore through the silence, but when the smoke cleared, the wolf was gone, vanished like a specter into the dark. Only its fading howl lingered, a warning that it would return, and not alone. The situation became unbearable. The wolves no longer targeted only the wounded. They stalked sentries, as if they'd learned to exploit the chaos of war. Both sides, German and Russian, realized that without action, they'd become prey on their own battlefield. Through covert messengers braving the perilous no-man's land between trenches, a rare agreement was forged, a temporary ceasefire to hunt the wolves. The idea, though bizarre, carried a cold logic. In this moment, the wolves weren't a threat to just Germans or Russians. They were the shared enemy of all who drew breath in that deadly forest. Jake and Tom joined a small hunting party, armed with rifles, knives, and vials of poison they hoped would fell the wolves. Every soldier in the group carried a palpable tension, knowing they risked not only the wolves, but also sniper fire from the Russians if the ceasefire faltered. Jake, with the spirit of an American raised on Rambo films, tried to lighten the mood, joking that they were hunting Hollywood style just without the epic soundtrack. Tom, ever pragmatic, shot him a look and told him to check his ammo, like he was drilling a rookie at Fort Bragg. On the Russian side, Mike and his close friend Alex Ivanov joined a similar hunting party. Under the icy moonlight, they ventured into the forest, each step a brush with death. The air reeked of blood and damp earth, a reminder that this forest no longer belonged to humans. The camaraderie, something any American veteran from Vietnam to Iraq would understand, became the fragile thread holding them together. Mike, though exhausted, felt a strange strength standing shoulder to shoulder with Alex, as if they weren't just hunting wolves, but fighting to reclaim some control from nature's cruel grip. The hunt stretched on like an endless nightmare. The hunting parties from both sides ventured deep into the forest, facing sudden ambushes from the wolves. These creatures didn't behave like normal beasts. They moved with terrifying coordination, like a trained army, striking and retreating before the soldiers could react. Hundreds of wolves were killed, their blood staining the white snow, but the cost was steep. Dozens of soldiers from both sides fell, torn apart in ambushes or succumbing to the biting cold during sleepless nights. When the ceasefire ended, Jake and Mike, unaware of each other's existence, returned to their trenches with heavy hearts. They had survived, but the memory of the wolf hunt haunted them. Jake, with the curiosity of an American raised on Bigfoot and Area 51 tales, wondered if these wolves were truly animals. Their red eyes, their deathly howls, they carried an unnatural quality he couldn't explain. Mike, steeped in Russian folklore of forest spirits, couldn't shake the feeling they'd faced something supernatural, summoned by the blood and smoke of war. As darkness reclaimed the trenches, both soldiers carried an unanswered question. Had the wolves truly been defeated, or were they merely waiting, lurking in the forest shadows, ready to return with their unending hunger? As the freezing winter days of 1917 dragged on, the tale of the wolves on the Eastern Front became a haunting mystery, transcending the icy trenches and snow-laden forests. In America, thousands of miles away, newspapers blazed with sensational headlines: "Wolves devour soldiers in war," and "Strange truce to fight beasts." Written with dramatic flair, these articles recounted massive wolf packs attacking German and Russian troops, forcing sworn enemies to lay down arms and face a common threat. To American readers, enthralled by X-Files-style horror and Hollywood monster flicks, it was the perfect story, chilling, thrilling, as if ripped from a Stephen King script. But was it real, or just a legend inflated to sell papers? Some skeptics, then and later, questioned the story's authenticity. They pointed out the lack of official Russian records about a so-called wolf truce. In a country spiraling into civil war and revolution, military logs were often incomplete, and tales of wolves might have been overlooked or deliberately buried. American skeptics, with their practical mindset, honed on everything from military reports to Area 51 conspiracies, argued that the press had exaggerated scattered animal attacks into a grand horror saga. But when viewed through the lens of history and the events in that frozen forest, the truth may be far more complex. The war's unrelenting destruction had shattered the Eastern Front's ecosystem. Hunters, once keeping wolf populations in check, were drafted to the front, leaving the forests unguarded. Later studies revealed that Russia's wolf population during World War I surged, sometimes by 30% annually, making them a force to be reckoned with. The brutal winter of 1917 worsened everything. Temperatures plummeted below +20°, freezing the wolves' natural prey. Deer, elk, rabbits, driving the packs into a frenzied hunger. Soldiers' corpses strewn across the battlefield became easy meals, but when frozen bodies ran scarce, the wolves turned their glowing eyes on the living. European history is no stranger to tales of wolves attacking humans, from the Beast of Gévaudan in 18th century France, a giant wolf rumored to have killed dozens, to World War II reports of wolves preying on children in rural Russia. These stories, though tinged with myth, stem from a grim reality. Wolves, when cornered, become fearsome predators. Jake Miller, if he'd lived to tell the tale, might have shrugged in his New York drawl. "I don't need official reports. I saw them, and they weren't house dogs." He'd witnessed wolves towering tall, their razor-sharp teeth gleaming, their red eyes blazing, charging into battle heedless of gunfire or flames. What elevates this story beyond a natural phenomenon is the wolves' unnatural behavior. They didn't fear humans or weapons, a rarity in wildlife. Some soldiers, German and Russian alike, swore they saw wolves too large, far bigger than any recorded. Their eyes, glowing like flashlights in the dark, seemed to carry an eerie intelligence, as if they weren't just hunting but fulfilling a mission. Whispers in the trenches spread, not just of wolves but of something more supernatural, awakened by the blood and smoke of war. Tom Hayes, Jake's close friend, shared a story that lingered long after. Before vanishing in the forest, Tom, with a distant look, recounted a legend he'd heard from a Cherokee friend in Pennsylvania. It said that when humans ravaged the land, wolf spirits, ancient guardians of the forest, rise to exact vengeance. "Maybe they're not just wolves," Tom whispered one night, as the campfire's glow lit his anxious face. His words, though soft, took root in Jake's mind, a seed of doubt sprouting in the darkness. Were the wolves they faced mere animals, or the embodiment of an ancient rage summoned by war's devastation? The question didn't just haunt Jake, but also Mike Petrov, the Russian soldier who survived the wolf hunts. Raised on Russian folklore of forest spirits and mysterious entities, Mike couldn't dismiss the feeling that the wolves wielded a power beyond nature. One night, staring into the dark, he swore he saw a wolf stand upright like a man, its glowing eyes locking onto his, as if to say this wasn't its war, but theirs. Truth or legend? The answer lies somewhere in the forest shadows, where soldiers' blood mingled with wolves on the snow. For men like Jake and Mike, the story needed no paper proof. They'd felt the hunger in those red eyes, heard the howls like curses echoing through the woods. And though American papers may have embellished to sell copies, what happened in the winter of 1917 remains a reminder that war isn't just a human struggle. Sometimes nature joins the fray with sharp teeth and an inexplicable fury. As the story spread from trenches to Brooklyn bars, it carried an unanswered question. Were those wolves truly animals, or the manifestation of something darker, roused by war's chaos? For those who'd heard the howls in the dark, the answer hardly mattered. In their hearts, the fear lingered, like a shadow waiting to rise whenever night falls. As the brutal winter of 1917 thawed into the damp days of spring, the forest on the Eastern Front clung to its dark secrets. Jake Miller, the American soldier who faced the wolves in those frozen nights, survived the war and returned to New York. But he was no longer the upbeat kid who joked about burgers and football. In his eyes lingered a wordless haunting, as if part of him remained trapped in that forest amid the howls and blood on white snow. Mike Petrov, the steadfast Russian soldier, also survived, but he buried his memories in silence, fearing that speaking them would brand him as a man unhinged by the fires of war. Jake, now sitting in a dimly lit Brooklyn bar, tried to share his story with old friends. Under flickering lights and the hum of jazz filling the air, he spoke of giant wolves, their red eyes blazing, their howls like a curse. But his listeners burst into laughter, pouring another beer and teasing. "You've been watching too much Twilight, Jake. Werewolves now?" Their carefree chuckles, though innocent, cut like a knife, silencing him. He stared into his whiskey glass, knowing the truth but struggling to explain what he himself couldn't fathom. Those wolves were unlike any creature he'd ever seen. They carried a terrifying presence, as if awakened by the blood and devastation of war, a curse from the forest's depths. In Russia, Mike bore a similar burden. He returned to a small village where tales of forest spirits were still whispered by hearths. Yet even there, he dared not speak. The villagers, hardened by war's pain, might look at him with pity, assuming battle stress had broken him. But on sleepless nights when moonlight streamed through his window, Mike still heard the howls echoing in his mind, sharp, menacing, as if the wolves were still watching from afar. Jake and Mike, separated by thousands of miles and unaware of each other's existence, were bound by an unanswered question. Were the wolves in that frozen forest merely starving animals, or something darker, summoned by war's chaos? They'd seen creatures move with uncanny intelligence, fearless of bullets or men. They'd felt the gaze of those red eyes, as if carrying an ancient rage beyond animal instinct. The folklore Tom Hayes shared about wolf spirits avenging ravaged lands and Russian legends of forest entities were no longer just campfire tales. They'd become a chilling possibility, sowing doubt in their minds. No one could answer with certainty. The wolf story once splashed across American newspapers with sensational headlines faded into a war legend, a tale for late-night bars or campfires. But for those who'd walked the darkness of a shadowed forest, who'd heard howls echo through bare trees, the question lingered, lurking like a phantom. Are the wolves watching you, waiting in the dark? Or is it all a hallucination of a mind shattered by war? Thank you for joining this chilling journey. If it sent shivers down your spine, share it with friends, especially those who love military history, horror, or just a wild battlefield tale. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to uncover more mysteries from war and beyond. We'll meet again in the next forest where the darkness always holds secrets waiting to be revealed.